Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I now ask David, have you got some notices?
Good morning, everyone. Right, I've just lost my voice much. Right, the first notice on the roundup is a reminder, it's a long distance shot saying our AGM will be on Monday, May the 2nd. Now, it's quite an important AGM for us this year because we're having to revise our constitution to allow us to have meetings, virtual meetings, face-to-face meetings, or virtual meetings, or a hybrid where, in fact, people could come in and watch us online. So we actually have to revise our constitution. Oscar gave us leeway for the last years, but we've been asked to amend our constitution. So please put that date in your diary. We need to have a good attendance that day in order to comply with the quorum and the numbers. If you're looking for things to do, u3a in Touch Scotland. This is, hello. This is one of the groups that actually started up during COVID. And they're having what they call coffee house discussions. So there's a note about one coming up in, yes, on Thursday, March the 31st. So the information will be in the roundup when it comes out. u3a in Scotland itself are having an assembly on Tuesday, March the 22nd. And normally the u3a in Scotland assemblies are normally limited to 1 or 2 people from each group. But now, because they're doing it online, anybody can actually join in that. So the details of that assembly are in the notice going out. And the last note I've got is about the census. How many people have... Oh, where are we? Had a sheet like this? Right. So you're all aware that you're going to have to do something. But in fact, one of the things about it is, and I think we want to share this information, is you don't have to do online. You can actually request to do it on a paper copy and send it in to them. So I think that's the thing I wanted to just raise in the notice going out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Right, well, I'm sorry to be here, ladies and gentlemen. Meg Luckins, who was going to talk to us, felt that in the present circumstances, her talk was largely based on Russia and Scotland, Scots in Russia, that perhaps the timing might not be ideal. So very apologetically, she felt she should withdraw from talking, but hopefully she will talk to us sometime next year. That damned Dutchman. Many of you will recognize him. He's not very popular in Scotland. William of Orange, William III. He hated this portrait. He hated all official portraits. He regarded them as grandiose and foolish and pretentious. For this portrait, which the City of London insisted on having done, his wife, Mary, persuaded or ordered him to have done. And I'll come to Mary later. What I'm trying to show today, I think, is that someone we might regard as a rather unimportant figure in our history, the history whether it's England or Scotland, was in fact one of the most significant kings we've had. And I know one or two people who would maintain that he was the most significant king that England or Scotland has ever had. That is Louis XIV. Louis did not dislike that portrait. He loved that portrait. During his lifetime, Louis had no fewer than 170 portraits painted of him. It was one of his favorite occupations. Louis was King of France from the age of 4 to the age of 76, a 72-year reign. He's an absolute monarch, as we know, as the Sun King. And he was incredibly ambitious. In his own words, "I shall act unfettered as I judge most fitting to the good of my state and to my glory. I shall be the Charlemagne of this age and shall surpass that great man in my conquests." And he almost did it. A map of Europe at this time. Just have a look at it for a moment. And the area between France and the Dutch Republic is the area of vital importance. The area of white in the middle are the scattered German states, some 30-odd of them. The state of Austria and Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire as such, which was under threat at the Ottoman Empire. Louis's plan was to take the area between, the whole of the area between France and Poland, to shut off the empire and force it to surrender to his power. And we'll see what happened. There's William again. He was only about 7 at the time, so he didn't have much chance to grumble about it. He was born in 1650. He was very sickly, asthmatic. He had a bad back condition, and indeed spent 6 years of his childhood in a back brace, a metal back brace. Many of the portraits that are painted of him, or the statues of William and so on, show him in armor. He couldn't wear armor. He couldn't carry any heavy weight at all. You might consider him a bit unfortunate. His father died when he was 2 days old. His mother died when he was 10. He was brought up by a series of guardians and tutors and was an intensely lonely individual. He was, of course, we think of him as being Dutch, but he was by family origins Burgundian. And gradually the Burgundians had spread their state from Orange up until they took over parts of Holland. Louis and his predecessors had been taking all that back. And by the time I'm talking about, which is about 1650, William, in fact, possessed nothing, no lands whatever. He was a stateless person. He might have expectations, and that was to become stadtholder of Holland. That was an elected ruler. But at the time I'm talking of, when he is born, the Dutch don't want him. They don't want him. blasted stadtholder. They want to run their own republic. And it's only in 1672, when they're at the verge of utter defeat at the hands of France, that they elect, grudgingly, William and asked him to lead their armies. To show you just what an awful situation that was, English ambassadors were sent to William, and they had a proposal. They said to him, look, we'll let you call yourself King of Holland if you want, but we want certain territories, the French want certain territories, and you can have what's left. William replies, I like better the position I have been given by my people. One of the ambassadors contemptuously said to him, well, in that case, you will only have to witness the destruction of your republic. And William's response, the best way to avoid that is to die defending it to the last ditch. From 1672 to 1688, that's exactly what he did. 16 years of constant warfare. He used every method he possibly could, including flooding large areas of his own lands to prevent French advances. But by 1688, things were really desperate. And here came the first real gleam of hope. There is his family tree, I think. Oh, I don't bother about it. That was never going to show up very well. He marries his cousin, Mary Stuart. There she is. She's an impressive girl, nearly 6 foot tall. She hadn't wanted to be married. It's an arranged marriage, but they grow to love each other a great deal. In fact, they adore each other. She's a wonderful person. Why there's never been a decent biography produced for her, I've never understood. She's highly intelligent. She's amusing. And the Dutch people take to her instantly. She's a great success. She is the eldest Protestant daughter of James Stuart, James II. She is a Protestant, and her sister Anna is a Protestant. But after they are born, their father James converts to Catholicism and has a second marriage. James is an unfortunate man. He's not an evil character at all. He's an idealist in his own way. Becomes king in 1685, a just, and immediately faces a rebellion, Monmouth's rebellion, which is put down with great brutality. He was suspected of intending to make Britain Catholic, and he would have liked that to happen. There is no evidence at all that he was going to force the countries to become Catholic, but people believed that he was. And as we know in politics, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is what people believe is the truth. It may seem a little bit cynical, but people were willing to tolerate James for a while. But in 1688, a particular event occurs, and that is the birth of a Catholic baby, James Francis, later to become the Old Pretender. Suddenly there is the prospect of long-term Catholicism, and a group of mainly nobles, a Whig, a Tory, a bishop, 2 sailors, 2 soldiers, nicknamed the Immortal Seven, send a letter to William asking him to come and take the throne of England on behalf of his wife, Mary. William looks at this letter and he says, what can I do? I'm busy fighting at the moment. I can't do anything about this. And it sits, as the way that mail does, sits on his desk for a couple of months. I don't know whether you have that sort of experience. And then something extraordinary happens, because Louis, who is on the verge of victory, I think, against the Dutch, Louis has a tantrum. He feels he is insulted by the Elector Palatine, the ruler of the Palatinate. Louis has demanded that a particular man is appointed as bishop of the Palatinate, and he's ignored. He is furious and switches his entire army from fighting William to invade the Palatinate. It's known as the devastation of the Palatinate. Everything is torn down. The great castle of Heidelberg is ripped down. His mind is blown up. Thousands of people are made homeless. But it gives William his opportunity. Quickly, he gathers what he can of the way of an army and sets about, by October, an invasion force. Now that is an incredible risk. If you think of the numbers of invasions, one way or the other, across the Channel, whether it's the Romans or the Normans, or the Plantagenets, or Napoleon's plans, or D-Day, or Hitler's intended plan, Operation Sea Lion, they were all based on summer. It was regarded as far too dangerous to risk a fleet in the Channel in autumn. William is taking this immense risk, and he's doing it because he believes it is the only thing that will enable him to stop Louis in the long term. He sets sail in mid-October. Storms hit his fleet. Several ships are lost. They're driven back to port. Over 2,000 horses die on board. His cavalry, potential cavalry, is just about wiped out. But he carries on. And at the beginning of November, his fleet lands at Torbay. He sets up camp at Exeter. He has maybe 17,000 troops, of which only 2,000 were cavalry. It should have been an absolutely hopeless situation. On Salisbury Plain is massed an army of some 35,000 under the command of John Churchill, later to become Duke of Marlborough. There are another 40,000 troops available in the south of England. William has to defeat those forces and get to London. It seems absolutely hopeless. But various things happen. Firstly, John Churchill, who, as we know, became a very great general. Churchill was one of the most unreliable individuals you could hope or not hope to meet. He changes sides. He goes across. Many people think that it was, after all, Churchill who had defeated Monmouth's rebellion at Sedgemoor. he was angry. He hadn't been rewarded enough. Churchill felt he should have had at least a peerage for what he'd done, and he hadn't received it. He was in a huff. So he switches over to William's side. And then, more damaging for James, his daughter, it's a quite sort of romantic picture, and so his daughter Anne, accompanied by Compton, Bishop of London, gallop through the night from London to join William. And this is just too much for James. James, who throughout his career had been brave, determined, strong-willed, a pretty brutal, as Duke of York, pretty brutal governor of Scotland, has a breakdown. He completely collapses. He sends his wife and son to France, and a week later attempts to follow them himself. He's stopped. He's recognized by a fisherman, put under house arrest in London. And a messenger comes to William and says, we've got James. What's the reward? And William says, for heaven's sake, let him go. Let him go. Let him escape. What would he do with him? He's married to James's daughter. You'd hardly string James up. And furthermore, there is still the great sort of a mythology about Charles I, the martyr king. Books have been produced, in fact, were produced in 1685, saying that he was basically, they felt that Charles was a god, that he had been there was this hero worship. Now, the last thing that William wants to do is to create anything similar. So he lets him go. The crown is offered to Mary. And William says, oh, no. I'm not going to stay here and accept the position of my wife's gentleman usher. Now, that may seem rather arrogant, but he's right, because if he needs an English army. He has no right to lead that army unless he has the crown. And furthermore, rightly, he is allowing the fact that his wife might die first, which would leave him with nothing, as prince consort with no powers at all. In fact, people say that this is the first joint monarchy. That's not actually true. When Philip married Mary Tudor, he was made king. He wouldn't accept being of a lower rank than his wife. But it was accepted then that as soon as Mary died, he would cease to be king. William is having nothing of that. And the English crown in 1689, the English crown is offered very narrowly in Parliament to William and Mary. And within a month, the same thing happens in Scotland. In fact, the Scottish Convention, by a larger majority, invite them to be monarchs. Now I'll come to a bit more on Mary. As William and Mary, again, interestingly, he'd have been forced to have that portrait as well. He's looking a bit sulky, I think. Yeah, he is, isn't he? Definitely a half. But interestingly, he was about 4 or 5 inches shorter than his wife. They must put him on a block or something or other, or dug a hole under her. But she is, as I say, a remarkable woman. William, in his years on the throne, is out of England much more than he's in England. And Mary until her death in 1694, governs in his absence. She is absolutely first rate. And he is devastated when she dies. He not only loves her, but he also listens to her. And she has a lot of common sense. He becomes a very isolated, miserable individual after her death. Once Parliament has offered the throne to William and Mary, very little else occurs in England. There are a few skirmishes. It's not the bloodless revolution quite. But most people accept the situation. In Scotland, however, things are slightly different. And we know that in spite of the convention offering the throne to them, the convention didn't really represent Scotland. And that's become even more obvious, of course, at the time of the Act of Union. There were a couple of battles. Killiecrankie, Dunkeld. But by 1690, Scotland is pretty well under William's control. He doesn't go there himself. In 1691, the clans are instructed to take an oath of allegiance to William and Mary. And that, of course, leads to the unfortunate events at the Massacre of Glencoe, which I'll come back to, or someone might be ask about that. Suffice it to say that, well, I'll just leave it at the fact that William doesn't really care about England. He cares even less about Scotland, and probably even less about Scotland than Ireland. He needs the material, the wealth of England. In Ireland, James, who seems to have recovered himself, James appears in Ireland himself, where he is the Earl of Tyrconnell, his number two, has established very strong and effective Catholic government in the south. They launch an attack on Protestant Ulster, and there is, of course, the well-known and lengthy siege of Londonderry. Firstly, one of the Dutch generals, Schomberg, goes over to oppose James's force, and then William himself arrives in May 1690, and leading to the Battle of the Boyne. Things very nearly changed at the Boyne. On the evening before the Battle of the Boyne, William was doing reconnaissance, and they are spotted. And a group come out from James's army and attack them. And a bullet takes off the top of William's coat, rips it off, just grazing his shoulder and so on. A couple of inches another direction. That would have been it. It's a pretty brutal battle. The Boyne, poor old Schomberg, who's 82, is killed. William is in pretty well a lot of the fighting. But they are victorious, and James goes back to France. A year later, another Dutch general, a man called Ginkel, wins the great battle of Ochrym. And that is followed by another of what I consider William's acts of genius, the Treaty of Limerick, because it is an incredibly generous treaty. He does not ask the Irish to take an oath of allegiance. He realizes, I think, that would be hopeless. He says, I want you to be tolerant of my regime. Care not who rules the government in Dublin. If you can't do that, we will provide ships to take you to France with all the belongings you wish, your family, anything you can sell, and so on. And your estates will remain the property of your family or those you wish to administer them. It's an incredibly unusual settlement. But William recognizes that he doesn't want any further trouble in Ireland. He's got to be able to concentrate on where it matters. Unfortunately, in the years that follow, we find that the Protestant ascendancy, as it grows, starts switching back all the terms of Limerick and confiscating the lands and so on. But that's not for another 20 or 30 years. But it's now that William can really concentrate on his main purpose, the 9 Years' War. Another 9 years' war fighting on the borders of what had been the Spanish Netherlands. Now that's the area, and what is important there to Louis is Louis wants to get control of the Rhine, the Scheldt, and the Meuse. If he can do that, he can shut off the empire from the sea, because the Turks have shut off the other side. He'll then be able to starve the economy of the empire and gradually use that, his military power, to take over the German states. That is his plan. Another map of Europe in 1702 or 1700. Doesn't it look so different? No. It looks almost identically the same, and it is just about the same. Nothing really has happened. So, I hear you cry. Why is he so great? What's he achieved? Well, it looks the same, but it's not quite the same. For this, William, or some of this, William takes no credit. The Austrians, the Poles in particular, and the Russians had several successes fighting the Ottomans. They had driven them back. They were, in fact, to come back again 30 years later and threaten Vienna and so on. But for the time being, the Ottoman threat seemed to be over, which meant that the empire, that Austria, could commit troops elsewhere. Where there had been just William and the Dutch preventing Louis from going forward, there was now a solid alliance. England, Scotland, yes, the Scots sent a considerable number of troops. England, Scotland, the Dutch Republic, the remains of the Spanish Netherlands, most of the German states, and the empire were formed into a firm alliance to prevent Louis's plans. And thirdly, France was bankrupt. Now, there are obviously huge expenditure by the Dutch and the English over this war. People had been heavily taxed, and there was the usual grumbles. But because of something that Louis had done, he had revoked the Edict of Nantes and started persecuting Protestants again. The whole, effectively, of the French cloth industry had moved. The weavers and so on had left. They'd gone either to Holland or many of them to East Anglia. Holland and England had thriving industry. Money was good. Louis had expended all this money on war, but he had added to his problems by producing that piece of architectural bling, Versailles, on which he had spent even more money than he had on warfare. Now, I mean, that's staggering to think that on a building you can spend more money on 9 years of war than on 9 years of war. But he manages it. And therefore, the balance of power is significantly different, even though the map looks identical. William is never loved in England. I don't think he cares. He's certainly not loved in Scotland, where he is blamed for the Massacre of Glencoe in the Highlands and where he refuses to promote the Scots who felt they should be promoted and rewarded in the convention. The irony is that whereas most of Ireland, Catholic Ireland, didn't like William, of course they didn't. They weren't very grateful for Limerick. People aren't grateful for that sort of thing. The one area where he remained really popular was, of course, in Ulster, the Ulster Protestants. And this whole idea of King Billy and that sort of stuff, William would have hated. William nominally was a Calvinist, but he was religiously totally tolerant. Actually, I think he was probably an atheist. He certainly didn't have any interest. His wife went to church every day. William grumpily went along about once a week. Come on, dear, off you go. And he hated excesses of religion. I think what I can do, his reservedness, this is regarding in England, his reservedness grew on him, this is particularly after the death of Mary, so that it disgusted many. But he had observed himself the errors of too much talking, more than those of too cold a silence. And that's what he's seen as being, is cold and unfriendly. I'm not sure it was unfriendliness, though. William has a cold determination. He has one aim. He resents anything that takes him away from what he regards as his mission in life. We know he did have other interests. He liked music. He loved gardening. Though I imagine it was sort of my love of gardening, watching other people doing it. But he really doesn't have any time for leisure. Unwillingly, he goes once or twice to Newmarket races and tries to be one of the lads, but it's not in his nature. Certainly, he can be accused too much of surrounding himself with Dutch, and that's resented in England, and that was probably a miscalculation on his part. But I'll give a final judgment on him from a Frenchman, and this is Saint-Simon, writing in 1702 on the death of William. King William of England was wholly occupied in calling all Europe to arms against France. Grown old before his time by excessive labors in the affairs of state that were his lifelong, all-absorbing passion, and to which he brought such consummate skill, such masterly genius, King William had come to possess supreme authority in Holland, the English throne, the trust, nay, the absolute dictatorship of all Europe, save only France. When dying, religion occupied his mind as little as throughout his life. Being solely concerned with the affairs of this world, he saw the end approach without misgiving. He had the satisfaction of leaving his grand alliance so firmly based that he had no fear of its disuniting after his death. That's all. I will, yes, certainly. I was just going to. There he is.
Does anybody have any questions? No? No? Too learned? No? Right. Jolly good.
Does this man have any connection with the Flying Dutchman? And why is he called the Flying Dutchman?
Mention again was the question of the Massacre of Glencoe. William signs the document, countersigns the order to take action against the MacDonalds of Glencoe. What he hasn't been told, and carefully hasn't been told, is that MacIan attempted to take the oath. And what William is not shown are the letters from the military commander in Fort William and the magistrate, Colin Campbell, that they'd accompanied with the information that he hadn't signed on time, both witnessing that he had made every effort to do so. William is not shown that. All he is told is that the MacDonalds of Glencoe have not taken the oath.
Maybe more a comment than a question. It's ironic, really, that when Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, a lot of French Protestants, Huguenots, went to Holland, and in the end, a lot of them joined the army and went with William when he went to Ireland. I think they were called the Huguenot regiments, and they fought in the Battle of the Boyne and then were rewarded sometimes with land in Ireland for fighting well. And my mother's ancestors, who were called Maze, M-A-Z-E, they settled there and were given land. So William took quite a lot of Huguenot regiments, didn't he, to Ireland, or to England first, and then across to Ireland.
Very much so.
James, by revoking the Edict of Nantes, didn't really, not James, Louis, by revoking the Edict of Nantes, didn't really help James. It was,
he didn't. And shot himself in the foot into the bargain. Yes, you're absolutely right in everything you say there.
No?
No?
Well, can I just say, Robert, can I just say many, many thanks for standing in at very short notice to give a very interesting talk. I'm not a historian, but I like some of the details that you brought out about the individuals. And perhaps you could get writing the book about Mary. Anyway, can I just ask you to also show your appreciation to Robert for this morning?
Thank you very much, David. Our next meeting is the 4th of April, when I hope Alan Stewart will be taking us through walking the Dublin estate. That's on the 4th of April. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, all the technicians. And Florence, thank you for the pictures.